The Democrats are trying to cancel the guy that 74 million Americans voted for. And they're so obsessed with that. Remember, they tried to remove President Trump from office before he got there. Now they're trying to remove him from office after he's left. How does this unify the country? How does this bring the nation together, which is what Joe Biden said he wanted to do on January 20th? So, again, I think the American people understand it.
I hope that you'll forgive me today, but I'm having cappuccino this morning. Why? Well, because it's 23 degrees outside and got about 6 inches of snow last night, and I just enjoy cappuccino on a snowy day. What my front yard looked like this morning when we got up. Of course, Ben had quite the time out there this morning running around in all this. These pictures were taken before he got out there, and the neighbors started plowing and everybody started. Some people are shoveling their walks. I have no idea why they're doing that, because we're expecting 3 to 4 more inches today. So these guys that are out there shoveling their walks, it's like, I don't know why you would do that. I mean, it's going to turn around and wait for another 3 to 4 inches that's supposed to be here throughout the rest of the day. Of course, the bad part of all this is it's going to turn to rain by tomorrow morning, which means that we're going to have all the snow will be gone by tomorrow afternoon in all likelihood, and that means that downhill they'll be facing flooding, and everybody's concerned about that. That's how my day started, and it's why I'm having cappuccino this morning instead of regular coffee. That and the interesting discussion I've been in over the last, 24 hours or so, since Friday, when I first heard about it, and I started talking about it on the Constitution Thursday discussion group, which if you're not a part of, and you'd like to be, just send me an email, dave@thedavebowmanshow.com, or contact me on Facebook or whatever, MeWe, and ask. We'll make you a part of it if you'd like to be a part of that. And it's not as active as I wish it was, but we did have a pretty good discussion about this idea, which is that Democrats are weighing a desperate scramble for Plan B to ban Trump from office using 14th Amendment as impeachment conviction unlikely. So the theory here is that the 14th Amendment's Section 3, which outlines that people who are guilty of treason or insurrection can be forbidden to ever hold office of trust under the United States again. Now, this is all based in the idea that there isn't going to be a conviction in impeachment 2.0. So follow me here. No conviction in impeachment 2.0. The Democrats then become, quote-unquote, desperate. And in fact, some of the headlines yesterday read, it's an intriguing idea. They're contemplating it. They're thinking about it. But they're clearly not thinking, well, clearly about it, because there's some obvious holes in the theory. However, it's enough that virtually every newspaper in the country, every news website in the country has it on a headline. I got an app that I picked up last week, a local news app that has it. Will the 14th Amendment be used to ban Trump forever? The idea here is, well, it does put a dent in my theory about impeachment 2.0, which is that's about the midterms. I still believe that. I still believe that it literally has nothing to do with Trump, and that Democrats don't care if they convict or not. What they want are Republicans to vote to acquit, and they're going to use that extensively in the midterms and in campaigns. But let's assume that I'm wrong, which isn't hard to do sometimes, and say, no, they're really desperate to do this. Well, if that's the case, you have to ask the question, can it be done? Can it be done under the 13th or the 14th Amendment? And can it be made to happen? Well, you got to go back in history, of course, to 1868, when the 14th Amendment was being created by Congress. It was the first of the Reconstruction Amendments, well, second of the Reconstruction Amendments, sorry, 13, 14, 15, the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th is pretty straightforward. Slavery and involuntary servitude are henceforth and forever banned. 14th Amendment is a little more complex, and it was a reaction to the failure of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which Congress tried to force a law that said states have to allow former slaves, African Americans, to be treated as citizens, to allow them to vote and all that. And of course, the reaction to this was, you can't tell us to do that. Remember, there is no incorporation at that point. Our state constitutions say otherwise. And we talked about this last summer during the 1876 series. We talked about how the states used states' rights to continue to deny African Americans fundamental rights as citizens. 14th Amendment sought to relieve that. It sought to establish the fact that they were citizens, they couldn't be denied the right to vote, comes in the 15th, so forth and so on. The man who is most personally responsible for this is a guy by the name of Senator Jacob Howard. And is a name that you probably don't know. It's a name that you probably, unless you're just a real wonk about this stuff, this guy, in fact, so, I don't want to say poorly known is he, but so lack of interest in him that there literally is almost one photograph of him in existence that I could find. And I didn't look a lot, but he's not well known, let's put it that way. He was, however, a very strong abolitionist. He was originally a Whig Party member. He found that the Whigs were not interested in abolition in the 1840s and 1850s. He had a problem with that. He left the Whig Party. He was one of the founding members of the Republican Party. In fact, it's Senator Jacob Howard who actually coins the term Republican Party. He's responsible for that. A good friend of Lincoln's. He works very hard with Lincoln to get the 13th Amendment written, passed, and ratified. In fact, he's probably the driving force behind the 13th Amendment. Chatter and Jeff used to ask that question, why was Lincoln so determined to get the 13th Amendment ratified? And the answer is because the Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order, and as we've seen in recent days, executive orders only last until the next president comes in and decides with his pen and phone to undo them. And Lincoln was concerned that a subsequent president might do that. But an amendment can't be undone like that. Get it in the Constitution, get it enshrined in the Constitution, and we're done. Well, Senator Howard helped significantly with that. When it came to the 14th Amendment, there were two things that Howard did that are significant. Number one, he's the guy that's most responsible for the citizenship clause in the 14th Amendment. Now, that said, it is interesting to go back and read his interpretation of it. His interpretation of it is very, well, it's different than the interpretation of it that most people have today. In his view, the man who wrote it, it really only applied to African American former slaves. And certainly, under no circumstances in his mind would it ever apply to anyone else, particularly Indians. He did not want Native Americans becoming citizens of the United States. Well, things happen and off you go. His second contribution to the 14th Amendment is Section 3, which is what we're talking about today. There was actually a proposal for Section 3 that initially was similar, but not quite as harsh. In other words, it looked at it and said, well, do we really need to ban these people for life for ever holding office again? And it kind of said, no, they're just sort of banned for a few years, and that should be good enough. But Howard didn't like that. Howard was a strict Reconstructionist. He was very much an abolitionist. He was very much a what was known in that time as a black Republican, a very hardline Reconstructionist Republican. And he hated the South. He hated the Confederates, hated them. And he wanted to see them punished. There's an old saw that says, hard cases make for bad laws. It didn't seem to matter much to Howard that there might be an issue downstream if we do this now. And so he is the one that proposed almost verbatim the verbiage that becomes the 14th Amendment, Section 3. And of course, it gets adopted, it gets ratified. Southerners in Congress they fight it tooth and nail because they see a problem downstream. You're trying to reunite a country. You're trying to bring people together, and you're passing a constitutional amendment that essentially, if you take it at face value in 1868, essentially disenfranchises half the country. Not only can the people who were former Confederates no longer hold offices, but the people who choose their representatives will not be allowed to choose their representatives except from the ones that the winners, the Republicans, in this case, have decided are acceptable. The Southerners don't like that. They fight it tooth and nail. It helps contribute to some of the issues with the 14th Amendment's ratification as the process goes on. I've told you before, a lot of people saw problems with the 14th Amendment. What's the word I'm looking for? Incorporation being one of the biggest ones. They saw that coming. And many states really were not comfortable with the 14th Amendment and the way it was written and the harshness of Section 3. They just didn't feel like it was bringing the country back together again. But Howard was absolutely determined to punish the South. He was absolutely determined to punish these insurrectionists, in his view. And consequently, he was dedicated to the idea of keeping that in there. He won the fight in Congress. Of course, the 14th gets ratified, although that's a discussion for another day. You could argue that it wasn't willingly ratified and so forth and so on. You want to talk about a conspiracy theory. Putting that aside for the moment, in his moment of triumph, in his, I finally succeeded in spanking those people, Senator Howard dies in 1871. By this time, Ulysses S. Grant is the President of the United States, and he has a problem. Number one, Grant, of course, is well known for his willingness, his magnanimous willingness to put aside past arguments, to move forward from Appomattox, where his terms of surrender for Robert E. Lee are very generous, and you know there's a story there about asking if his men are hungry. Do you need food? We've got plenty of food, and sending wagons of supplies to the Confederate troops so that they could eat. Grant was not, for all his reputation as a butcher and all his reputation as a general, Grant was a very understanding human being. He had a very good sense of empathy for people. And maybe that's what made him a great general. Maybe it isn't. Maybe that was the hurdle he had to overcome to win that. I don't know. It'd be an interesting study sometime. But the bottom line was, as president, he's trying to unify a country that's still badly fractured. And the people of the South have a bunch of men who are willing to, able to, experienced to, capable of, and desirable of being their representatives in the government. And the Constitution and Congress is telling them no. You can't do it. Sorry. No, thou shalt not. We don't like them. You have to pick from other people that we approve of. And of course, this is not sitting well with half the country. Half the country is being, well, they're getting really pissed off. And in fact, Grant looks at this and sees the rise of the KKK, the rise of the red shirts, the rise of things that will happen in later elections as being made worse by this law, this constitutional amendment and subsequent law passed by Congress that outlaws these people from holding office. Even though they've taken loyalty oaths, even though we've reunited as a country, he sees this as, oh, all you're doing is taking half the country and telling them that they can't run things the way they want. In other words, he writes, when the purity of the ballot is secure, majorities are sure to elect officers reflecting the views of the majority. I do not see the advantage or propriety of excluding men from office merely because they were, before the rebellion of standing and character, sufficient to be elected to positions requiring them to take oaths to support the Constitution, and admitting to eligibility those entertaining precisely the same views, but of less standing in their communities. In other words, this need for Howard's revenge law was hurting the country. It was keeping it from moving forward, and indeed, it was making things worse. Amendment 14, Section 3, was making things demonstrably worse in the country. It was dividing us, not uniting us. Congress took this up, and they passed a couple of laws. In the early 1870s, they passed a law basically saying, okay, if you were a Confederate and you'll take this oath, the penalty is repealed. We're not doing this anymore. They did that for basically all but two Confederates, Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. There's some arguments there either way. Be that as it may, even those two were restored by 1898. In 1898, the country found itself embroiled in another conflict. And indeed, during the Spanish-American War of 1898, Congress said, you know what, we need all of these people because they've got experience and we need them. Not Lee and Davis, obviously, but they just blanket did away with the whole thing. No more Confederates are banned. And Joe Wheeler, the former Confederate cavalry officer, was involved in a battle in Cuba, and his men started. By this point, he's a general in the U.S. Army, no longer Union Army, but U.S. Army. And his men are winning the battle, and they're chasing the Spaniards up the hill, and he's got his sword up in the air, and he's yelling, "Whip them Yankees, boys, whip them Yankees!" And one of his officers had to pull him aside and go, "Dude, no, they're Spaniards." He was like, "Oh yeah, forgot." It's a true story, folks. It's absolutely true. Since that time, only once has Article 14, Section 3 ever been invoked, ever. It was invoked in 1919 in the state by Congress against a congressman who had been elected from the state of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where the real Americans live. Now, Victor Berger was a newspaper publisher in Milwaukee. He was a socialist, a hardline socialist, and had been very much against the war, World War I, against American entry into World War I. And if you know anything about that time period, many people were. Victor Berger used to publish articles criticizing the government's policy in World War I, criticizing the entry into World War I, criticizing a lot of the involvement in World War I. And of course, with a name like Berger, it wasn't long before he was indicted for sedition and charged with a crime. His trial was overseen by Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who is a name familiar to those of us in baseball. The trial created all kinds of problems because Landis was known and, in fact, proven to be pretty biased. Didn't handle the trial well. So this trial dragged on and on and on. And in the meantime, there was a special election in 1919 in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, to send, because they lost a congressman, so they needed to send someone in, and Victor Berger is elected. When he gets to Washington, D.C., Congress, seeing this guy under indictment for sedition, which you could argue was an exercise of the First Amendment, decides to pull the 14th-3, and they say, nope, this guy cannot be in Congress. And they refuse to seat him. They send him home, and this forces Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to have yet another special election. And so they do, because, well, okay, we'll have a special election. And they elect Victor Berger in the special election to replace Victor Berger, who Congress refused to seat. They still refuse to seat him. He goes home. There's another special election. A Republican wins. 2 years later, Victor Berger defeats him, goes back to Washington, D.C., and by this point, Congress has kind of realized that Grant was right, that pissing these people off isn't worth the effort. Milwaukeeans are just going to keep electing this guy who represents their views, as Grant said, until we come up with some actual reason. And by the way, is he ever convicted of sedition? Is he ever convicted of being a traitor? No. They eventually give up. He spends 3 more terms in Congress before he is defeated and then goes home and is killed in a traffic accident, which is, again, can't make this stuff up. The lesson here, though, is that Grant was right. These people wanted to have Victor Berger as their congressman. He represented their views. He represented what they believed. He represented who they were. And they were not happy with Congress telling them that, no, you can't have that guy. You can only have people we approve of. Just like Grant had faced, 50 years earlier. Now, the kicker in all of this, of course, is that as part of the 14th Amendment, Congress passed a law. The law made rebellion or insurrection a crime. 18 Code, U.S. Code 2383. It's one of the shortest ones you'll ever read. This is the entirety of it. Whoever incites, sets on foot, assists, or engaged in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States or the laws thereof, or gives aid or comfort thereto, shall be fined under this title and imprisoned not more than 10 years or both, shall be incapable of holding any office under the United States. This is the law that backs Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Now, the drawback here is, as we said earlier, hard cases make bad laws. Hard cases, Confederates actually shot at Americans. Can you make that argument about Trump and Trump supporters or rioters in Washington, D.C.? Can you make that argument that they actually shot at Americans? I don't know that you can. In addition to that, because it's now a crime, because it's now on the law books, it requires a conviction in order to inflict punishment. Well, we're not going to get this conviction. Dems are desperate, scramble. They're not going to get that conviction. So where is this conviction going to come from that's going to allow them to do this? Now, the argument is Victor Berger was just under indictment. He had not been convicted of this yet. We can do this because he's under indictment. And maybe the constitutional argument is maybe they can do that. It's been done once. Consequently, it can be done again. But here's the real question. Who would actually think that this was a good idea? Do Democrats actually believe that pissing off half the country is a good idea? Now, I realize that there are some of you out there and some Democrats who are just so blinded and focused on what you want that you're willing to do anything. I get that. I understand that. But even U.S. Grant realized that using this particular amendment's Section 3 was harmful to reuniting, carrying the front country forward. It was a hard case that made for bad law. And ultimately, he realized that it wasn't a good idea. Ultimately, Congress realized that keeping Victor Berger out, even though he was under indictment for sedition, for being against World War I, was a bad idea. It didn't serve the people of Wisconsin in any way, shape, or form. Does Article 14, Section 3 really serve the interests of all of American people? Does it really help unite us? Does it really move us forward? Is it really worth pissing off half the country? And I mean really pissing them off? U.S. Grant didn't think so. U.S. Grant thought it was dangerous, thought it was harmful, thought it was hurting things. And here's the thing. He was right.